Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, we've been away for just a bit, had a nice trip with my wife over to Europe, and I'm so glad to be back and to be with you. It's just some 20 days till elections in the United States. I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach to the upcoming events of that election by talking about the Nobel Laureates. A number of them have been announced, and the one I want to talk about specifically today, and I'm going to quote from a press release, is the 2024 Nobel Prize Awards for Economic Sciences. Nobel Prize-winning economists. What do they think? What are the implications for our upcoming election? And more specifically, what this podcast is all about, leadership. How will the leaders and leadership inform what happens next? So, I think this could be really interesting. It's a little deep. It's certainly academic. I thought that was important, though, with 20 days to go, because we seem to be so caught up in this paralyzing separation, divisiveness between the right and the left in the United States. And it really is not been focused on leadership. As you know, that is the lifeblood of this podcast. It's my life's work and my life's passion. But I think it's also the critical component to this upcoming election. So, a bit of an academic approach, but I think it's important that we look at it from a different angle because we're missing, I think, a very important component. Okay, so as I said, I'll read from the press release from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. They had decided to award the Nobel Prize for 2024 for economic sciences to 3 people, each from the United States, not originally, but each presently from the United States. I'll list their names. Daron Acemoglu. He's from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Simon Johnson, also from MIT. And James Robinson from the University of Chicago. Now, I'll go into some detail and take even a little more deeper detail as we go along. But in general, what they have done and what they've been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics this year was for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. So already I began to think about the elections and say, well, under whose leadership would Americans and ultimately the world prosper? So here we go. Again, reading from the press release, and then I'll stop and offer my comments as we go along. The committee says, they've helped us understand differences in prosperity between nations. This year's laureates in the economic sciences, Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, have demonstrated the importance of societal institutions for a country's prosperity. Societies with a poor rule of law and institutions that exploit the population do not generate growth or change for the better. So their research, the 3 of them together collectively, really brings this point out in a very analytical, empirical way. Let me state again what the central thesis is here and why I think it's so important for leadership. Each of these academics have demonstrated the importance of societal institutions for a country's prosperity. And here we go, once again. Societies with a poor rule of law and institutions that exploit the population do not generate growth or change for the better. Think about that. Think about the candidates in this year's election. Think about which seems wedded to the rule of law and the value and worth of institutions, which would exploit populations, the people, us, our world, and then know that the one that follows that rule of law, that value of institutions, will bring about growth and change for the better. Those that exploit the population, don't follow that rule of the law, don't value our institutions, likely will not. So this is not a debate or an argument. This is years and years of research resulting in these three gentlemen receiving the Nobel Prize in economics this year for concluding that statement empirically. How'd they go about doing it? Sort of a short dive here. I'll take a little deeper dive in just a moment. So they looked at European colonies in large parts of the globe. The institutions in those societies changed over time. This was sometimes dramatic, but did not occur in the same way everywhere. In some places, the aim was to exploit the indigenous population and extract resources for the colonizers' benefits. In others, the colonizers found inclusive political and economic systems for the long-term benefit of these European migrants. The laureates have shown that one explanation for differences in countries' prosperity is the societal institutions that were introduced during colonization. And what we want to do now is say, and that continues over time. And perhaps today we are at an important inflection point, perhaps an existential point, to say, which way are we going to go? One that is linked to the rule of law and institutions, or one that may exploit the people, the populations, and we need to go and vote to make that call. The researchers say that these inclusive institutions, often introduced in countries that were poor when they were colonized, over time resulted in generally prosperous populations. They conclude that way back when to the present, depending upon how the society and its institutions were looked at, addressed, lived, experienced, determined the prosperity of that country. Were they linked to the rule of law? Were they linked to institutions in a favorable way? Or were they not? Meaning, were they inclusive or were they extractive? Some countries became trapped in a situation with extractive institutions, and that resulted in low economic growth. The introduction of inclusive institutions would create long-term benefits for everyone. Now, you've heard me talk on this podcast many times about this notion of everyone, right? And I've done it in several ways which are critical to our leadership core competencies, right? One, the notion that a rising tide not only can and could, should, but a rising tide must raise all boats. And it does. A rising tide raises all boats. So if we are linked to that, if we are believing in that, all boats will rise. This other axiom I've often referred to, non sibi, the term not for self, but for others. Who are we about? Are we about serving the collective? Are we about serving others? Or are we about self? And again, think about our elections. We have a very clear distinction that we can make here. Are we for the we, the us, the our, that middle class, that working person, or are we for those only at the top, or primarily at the top, to be fair? Okay? So what these Nobel laureates of 2024 are saying is that makes a critical difference in whether the nation, the society, prospers or not. Okay. What if it's the or not? Well, those people would like to stay in power. They could offer a threat. And unfortunately, the people may counter with a threat. They would like to remain in power. They would like to placate the masses by promising economic reforms. We see that in the debate today. But the population is unlikely to believe they will not return to the old system as soon as the situation settles down. In the end, the only option may be to transfer power and to establish democracy. So each of these three Nobel Prize winners have concluded. Quote, reducing the vast differences in income between countries is one of our time's greatest challenges. The laureates have demonstrated the importance of societal institutions for achieving this. Well, so it's the global effect as well, right? It not only benefits our country and our society, but it would benefit the world as well. Okay, so we're at this point, and we're talking about whether or not a candidate is making a point about people in a town in America eating pets, right? Cooking pets. I mean, it's in this sort of bizarre, crazy thing of saying that they might want to be a dictator on day one, that they might bring military force, National Guard, or military personnel as well, to arrest people in the United States. Well, it's pretty amazing how they are trying to do what these Nobel laureates are saying in a way that would not lead to prosperity. Okay, so let's take that little deeper dive now and say, what are these incredibly bright economists saying? Well, they're giving new insights into why there are such vast differences in prosperity between nations. One of their explanations is persistent differences in societal institutions. By examining the various political and economic systems introduced by colonizers way back when, particularly European, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson have been able to demonstrate a relationship between institutions and prosperity. They've also developed theoretical tools that can explain why differences in institutions persist and how institutions can change. Now think about that. They honestly believe that some of these institutions, even with long-held policies, can in fact change. Think about that in terms of addressing the immigration problem. Do we really want to create legislation for the good? Can we do that together? Can we do that collectively? And at the moment, it appears not, right? We had a bill. The Republicans, led by Donald Trump, were quite vociferous in making sure that that bill did not see the light of day. Why? Because problem identification is their modus operandi. What should leaders do? Think about this as that leadership moment, doing the right thing. Leadership should be about problem solving, not problem identification. So, if you want to have prosperity, it is best to follow the rule of law. It is best to support institutions and change them where necessary, and these scholars argue that that change is possible and has been demonstrated over economic history for a long period of time. Think about something like gun control. Do we want to change from a gun culture, 100 shootings per night in the United States, to something better, to something less, to alter a gun culture? What about the issue of reproductive rights? Can we make clear that a woman bleeding out, sadly, tragically, horrifically, in a parking lot outside a hospital is not pro-life, is not. It is, in fact, pro-death. In fact, people have died. So, if we believe in a faith, in a spiritual guide, how could we conclude that that is a proper course of action? We can't. And so can we change? And these academics believe, yes, change is possible, particularly on important issues. And so we look at the opportunity as we get within 20 days of an election. Do we want to prosper as a society? Do we want to prosper as a nation? Well, we have the opportunity to do that. And we know that if we link ourselves to the we, to the us and the our, that we have an opportunity to prevail. How does that manifest itself? It manifests itself in a prosperous economy, in a positive economy for all because of its inclusive nature, non-sibby, not for self. But we have a candidate and a party who is about creating this divisiveness, this extractive tax cuts as an example for the highest earners, for the largest corporations. And there we see a real opportunity for change. And so I'll conclude with that. Say thank you as we get closer. Remember that there is a sound, solid, empirically driven argument advanced by these 3 new Nobel Prize winners that inclusiveness and belonging to a positive and affirmative society and realizing the benefit of positive and affirmative government, political, economic institutions, and their capacity not only to do good but to change and make for better is really an important economic driver. From a leadership point of view, folks, this, I think, is a very, very compelling argument. Listen to what these economists are saying, that the we, the our, the collective, will raise the tide of all boats. Data suggests that. History suggests that. We have the opportunity to make that happen. Okay. Thank you all so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. It's a little bit different message, an economic message from 3 new Nobel Prize winners. But I think it's important because what it says is there is data and empirical research over a long period of time to say that linking ourselves to that rule of law, to institutions, and changing where necessary to raise the tide of all boats is doing the right thing, which is the very central framework of what this podcast in leadership is all about. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great day. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.